It was busier this last week. But yeah, we could just highlight a few items.
Yep.
So for those in the room already, thank you guys so much for joining. Now, week 3 of the workshop Colloquium series this spring. It's a pleasure to have all of you. I know, as Angie just said, folks will continue to trickle in, so we'll give them a moment to do that. And while we're waiting, just a few reminders and updates. This Wednesday, we're going to be continuing our research series with Jamie Carini from the Jacobs School and the college. That's going to be fantastic. So look forward to that presentation, Jamie. You guys might remember Jamie also gave a great talk during the commemoration at the new Ostrom Commons and the unveiling of Lin's statue this last fall. So no pressure, Jamie. You raised the bar quite high with that, though. And then also, for anybody interested, we do have the workshop's annual report. We have a public-facing version of that that's coming together this week. We have our presentation for OVPR. So for any workshoppers on the call who would like that, we'll be placing it on the website, but just let me know and we can get you a copy of it fresh off the digital presses as well, because we have that presentation coming up later this week too. So those are the other main agenda items. I don't think I'm forgetting about a Tocqueville program this week. But perhaps there's a data salon series, Angie, coming up. So I'll let you talk about that if you'd like to. And Angie is going to be kindly covering our introductions for our distinguished speakers, James Boyle and Jennifer Jenkins. So thanks so much for doing that, Angie. Welcome, James and Jennifer. I wish we could welcome you physically, but thanks for joining us virtually. Really appreciate it. And over to you, Angie.
Hello, everyone. So yes, we have a data salon coming up, not this week, but next week on the 18th. And we will be talking about data trust as it relates to health and social services related information and some really exciting stuff that we're doing in that area. But to not further ado, I loved this paper, so I really want to leave a lot of time to discuss the Mark of the Devil, the University as Brand Bully by James Boyle and Jennifer Jenkins, who were fortunate to have both of them here today from Duke University. I will be keeping the queue as best I can, but it's often easiest just to raise your hand and then I'll go through it and ask you to unmute your mic. But of course, as always, you're welcome to write in the chat as well. And I will do my best to paraphrase if needed your questions. So James and Jennifer, if you'd like to take over.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Angie. Thank you, Scott. Thanks to Alison Sturgeon for all of the work she did arranging it. It's a delight and a pleasure to be here. I was fortunate enough to meet and even to work with Lin Ostrom. In fact, this will be part of my presentation. I got in contact with her and said, so listen, I've read everything you've written about the commons and managing the commons, and you want to work on intellectual property. She said, no, it's not my field. I said, yes, it is. And she said, no, it's not. And I said, you really think that, but you're wrong. And while I have few virtues, persistence is one of them. And eventually, I kept telling her, no, all the stuff you write about is here. And basically, to prove me wrong, she started looking at it. And then she went, wait, it's all here. And I said, yes, I told you that you would find this. So this paper is in part a little homage actually to Lin's work. She attended the very first conference of the public domain ever held, the first time there had ever been a conference on the public domain, which was 20 years ago, in the world, so far as we know. Her work was on managing the knowledge commons with the wonderful Charlotte Hess. So thank you. It's a particular pleasure to be here, as you can imagine, because of all of that. So first thing, before I go on, you might think, why are we listening to a couple of lawyers talk about trademark law, and in particular to do with like sports stuff and you know, merchandise? Well, you're not actually. What you're reading is a paper about the commons and about managing the commons and the balance between property and the commons and the danger of assertions of property rights that actually encroach on the commons. What you're reading about is a comedic commons rather than a tragedic commons, the possibility of a comedy of the commons. What you're reading about is, to a large extent, collective action problems, which I know are at the center of many of the workshops that you've done. What you're reading about is a behavioral economics problem or a puzzle, which is what Duke is doing here makes no sense economically, yet they are doing it, which inspires us to ask the question, why? And I think there's some really interesting behavioral econ type explanations there. So this is, though you might not think it, right up your collective street. Okay, enough ado about that. So this is the discussion of trademark bullying. You might think, well, what does that have to do with it? with what he just said. The central theme of all intellectual property scholarship, and I'm not speaking too broadly when I say that, is the line between property and the commons. And in the case of the intellectual commons, obviously you don't have the danger of resource depletion. It's hard to overgraze an idea, but you do have all kinds of other problems that people who study property rights, property theory, and the commons have found. In particular, in every intellectual property domain, what we have to do is get right the balance between the commons and exclusive property rights. So imagine if Moderna or Pfizer had been unable to secure patents over the vaccines they're putting out. We probably wouldn't have them yet. But also imagine if there were exclusive rights, patents over the basic building blocks, the genetic sequencing, for example, which enabled them to do the research. We also wouldn't have the vaccine, right? That's a line that we try and draw using the tools of property theory analysis, commons analysis. In copyright law, the same is true. Facts and ideas go immediately into the public domain. I have a book called The Public Domain. It's under a Creative Commons license. You can download it for free. But the point is, as soon as that book was published, the ideas and facts went immediately into the public domain, and I don't have and never did have any control over them, other than perhaps by getting you to cite to me through academic honesty norms. But now to trademark. What's the line between property and the public domain, property and the commons in trademark law? Well, as you'll see, first you have to understand a little bit about the basics of trademark, and for that I'll turn it over to Jennifer.
Okay, so some trademark basics before we proceed. Ownership of a trademark does not convey absolute property rights in a word or symbol. The purpose of trademark law is efficient communication between us, consumers, and producers of products. So Dove can prevent other producers of bath products from putting Dove on their soap or their shampoo, so that I, when I'm rushing through the supermarket in an increasingly frenetic and freaked out fashion that we are now when we go grocery shopping, if I see Dove on some soap, I know it's produced by the same people who made the soap that I liked in the past. So trademark only confers rights to use a word or symbol exclusively within a particular domain. Dove chocolate does not infringe Dove soap. Delta Airlines does not infringe Delta faucets, or vice versa. The existence, another soap product, of Ivory soap does not prevent others from having trademarks in Ivory Coast, Ebony and Ivory, Ivory Design. So trademark law only prevents uses that are likely to cause consumer confusion in the marketplace. Ivory on that, was that produced by the same company that makes Ivory soap? But to quote Professor Mark Lemley, who teaches at Stanford, trademark cannot be transformed into rights to control language. As Jamie mentioned, trademark law deliberately leaves a commons of words and symbols that is open for other businesses, other competitors, and indeed us to use. So in comparative advertising, if Nissan wants to say, hey, the Nissan Leaf is better than the Toyota Prius, they can use Toyota's trademarks in order to engage in comparative advertising. And of course, there is a whole range of non-commercial uses, criticism, commentary, parodies, any kind of expression that simply is not reached by the trademark right. So that's the line between the property right and the commons. What? There's a balance. One side of trademark law is the right that ensures efficient communication in the marketplace, and the other is preserving this commons for us, for citizens, and for other businesses. But sometimes, notwithstanding the actual rules in the law, some trademark owners claim to own far more than they do. Sometimes they harass and intimidate beyond what the law can reasonably be interpreted to allow. That's called trademark bullying. These people are called trademark bullies. So we were familiar with this, but one of the things that inspired this article were rankings such as this. So look at this, our beloved university, Duke University was ranked #2 4 years running on a list of notorious trademark bullies. Now, this was not just a list of universities or academic institutions or nonprofit. #2 among everyone who owns trademarks, and even the most aggressive brand names, Monster Energy always being at the top of that list. I went to Duke graduate school, I went to Duke Law School. I love this university. It pained me to see this allegation. And so we saw this and we thought, what is going on here? So as intellectual property professors, as someone, I've practiced trademark law for 20 years and now teach it at the law school, we decided to dig a little deeper and try to figure out what on earth was going on here. Was our beloved university actually a trademark bully?
Yes, Jennifer said, and by the way, I hope you don't mind our preferences to be very informal and off script. She said that we love our university. The reverse may not be true after this article. So I think we have to acknowledge that. Second favor, I know a lot of you are in situations where you can't turn on your videos, but those of you who are teachers know how hard it is to teach to a whole bunch of black boxes. So if you can turn them on, and I understand if you can't, totally understood. There may be kids, there may be whatever, you know, but if you can, it helps to see just how bored you are by our presentation.
And we just fuzzed out. So
yeah, that's okay.
Me fixing the
there
fuzziness.
Okay, so don't worry, we appear to have disappeared into a virtual green screen, but we will reemerge. It's going to happen. So the comparative study. It's just, I like this. It's kind of like it's like we're in the witness protection program. As soon as I said Duke was going to get us, we disappeared into a virtual witness protection program. I'm not
Coincidence?
Quite sure. I think not.
Huh.
Okay, well, he'll come back.
Well,
so we were trying to figure out, these studies are put out by people who want to sell their trademark consulting services. And frankly, they are not necessarily correct. They are not necessarily true. Their methodology is extremely unclear. It's not obvious what they're doing. So it's not really clear that we can rely on them. So we thought, well, how can we figure out whether or not Duke is actually acting as a trademark bully? So what we thought we'd do is look at Duke's rate of opposing other people's trademarks, so-called oppositions. When somebody else files something, so if somebody filed something for Duke Blue Devils, Duke can and should say, hey, you shouldn't do that. So we went to look at this and we thought we would try and find similarly situated universities to see if there were any endogenous variables that might explain it. Because of course, asserting your trademarks isn't a bad thing. If somebody's violating them or if somebody's trying to get a mark that trenches on yours, you absolutely should. So we first of all tried a comparative study where we looked at other universities that might be similarly situated to see how often they oppose trademarks. So these are the top 10 schools, according to the evil US News and World Report, top 10 schools academically. That trick really works. And as you can see, so you see, you did the reveal. So those are the top 10 schools academically. That's how many, there we go. That's how many oppositions they filed. And then we look at Duke. And when we started looking at this, we felt like epidemiologists who had thought that they were doing something, you know, where there's a tiny, like little, probably not statistically significant piece of data. Like I'm looking at whether or not using your cell phone increases the likelihood of some, you know, malady. And actually the thing that they'd given us to research was cigarettes and cancer, where the sort of like the correlation is just like is so large and so you just can't ignore it. So we thought, okay, it's not academic. Yeah, sorry. What about if we looked at top 10 in terms of athletic revenues? Because Duke has a relatively well-known athletic program, particularly basketball program, as you may know, being from Indiana. And so here you can see, look, there's a few more oppositions being raised. And again, when we bring in Duke, yeah. So clearly what's happening here can't be reduced to whether or not these are earning the schools that earn a lot of money off athletics. What if basketball has something weird about it? Good. See, I do remember when we beat Duke in 2002 pretty quickly. That's why I raised it. Jason Williams, I think, missed the free throw. It broke my heart. So what about basketball programs? Was that it? And again, well, you know what's coming. Yeah. So something is going on here, but you can't explain it by academic prestige or athletic revenue, or basketball, any one of which might lead other people to try and creep a little too close to your trademark so that you have to brush them back in an opposition proceedings. Before I turn it over to Jennifer, you should know that these opposition proceedings, which are raised in front of the USPTO, are actually proceedings where you file for a trademark and the examiner themselves will go through and go, no, that's too close to Duke's trademark, and they'll boot it out. So you don't need often to raise an opposition. The examiner's already looked to see if there's a confusingly similar mark. What Duke is doing, what anyone doing in opposition, is after that step. Okay, so what happens now? Maybe Duke was right to oppose all these things and everybody else's general counsel is just asleep at the switch. Seemed unlikely, but we are academics, right? We have to explore every possibility. We thought we should look also at the question of Duke's, the quality of Duke's oppositions.
And Scott remembers in the chat.
That's what I said. That was the Jason Williams Smith free
Yes.
show.
And by the way, if you have any questions, we have the chat up. We can see it in real time. So you're welcome to type any questions or points into the chat. So as Jamie mentioned, you know, maybe something about Duke means that vastly dozens and dozens of more people are trying to encroach on Duke's protected terrain. Well, being trademark lawyers, we decided to dig into the data. And so we painstakingly, and I mean painstakingly, read 136 of these long and drawn out, and the oppositions are like hundreds of pages, over 100 pages often, opposition proceedings that Duke filed between 2015 and 2018 during a 4-year period. And we hand-coded them on a 4-point scale. From clearly erroneous, the legal term for that non-lawyers is bogus. So from bogus to far-fetched, claims that were really kind of a stretch, to arguable, maybe Duke has a point, at least they have some arguments in their favor that this might be problematic under trademark law, to sound when the claims were well-grounded in existing trademark law. So Duke does have many trademarks. They have the word Duke for our university educational services and for our athletic programs and for some merchandise. They have the image of the devil. They have the composite term blue devil. And then they have various stylized Ds for Duke. So Duke does have these trademarks, but as we mentioned before, under trademark basis, their trademark rights only extend to other uses that are likely to cause confusion in the marketplace. They do not own the word Duke. In fact, right now, what you see on your screen are all of the other live and well existing federal registrations for marks that contain the word Duke that are not owned by Duke University. As of today, there are 136 of those. Why are there so many other Duke marks? Because Duke is a surname, Duke is a first name, Duke is a nickname, Duke is a slang for fists or getting in a fight. The Duke of Devonshire is a cider apple, right? Duke is a word out there. Duke doesn't own the word Duke. It owns Duke for educational services and medical services, etc. But based on its trademark over Duke, what has Duke opposed in these proceedings that Jamie talked about? Cuke for electronics, Go Luke, Le Duc, the Dude diet for a diet-related website and book. This was special. Again, you never know what you're going to do when you dig into your data set. This is for real. Duke opposed Dear Duty Major Duke with this image of this gentleman on the John, which was a mark for toilet deodorants and for a footstool that you place your feet on when you're doing your business. And Duke's with the dog and everything for beer from Jacksonville. All right. These were all classified as bogus because under trademark law they were. But they go further. So you saw Duke owns images of a devil's head. It doesn't own the word devil, has no trademark in the word devil alone, just blue devil. Yet it opposed Pretty Devil for slot machines, this kind of scrawled image of a devil's head, devil's nightmare, and devil's garden for alcoholic products. What? Duke's trademark right over the devil's head does not extend this far. Even more, based on the Duke D, it opposes all these uses of Ds when perhaps the D is being used because it's the first letter of your business, or as a prefix, or as a suffix, or because it's somehow relevant to the product. These are even more far-fetched. And finally, based on Duke's trademark Blue Devils, it goes after anyone who uses the word blue, the color. There are almost 8,000 marks, including the word blue, stay blue, true blue, all these, true blue for denim products. Get your blue on for charitable fundraising for prostate cancer awareness. And finally, blue food, where Duke said that blue food was both something called descriptive and simultaneously misdescriptive of the food. So presumably either the food was blue or the food was not. Anyway, okay, got it. So these are all marks that Duke opposed. Long story short, yeah, sadly, our university is a trademark bully. You can see there were only 6 in a 4-year period that we classified as sound, which would put Duke on the mean with other large athletic schools for the number of oppositions filed. So Duke's a trademark bully, but it's an interesting bully. So I'll turn it over to Jamie to talk about implications from the findings from our 2 studies, our comparative study and our merit study.
I want to leave a lot of time for discussion, so we'll sort of summarize the theoretical portion of our paper here. Basically, there's a set of things which we can pursue in the chat. What we were uncovering were a series of changes to trademark law, changes to culture, and changes to university culture, all of which were interrelated, all of which affected each other. In terms of trademark law, we focused on expansion of trademark rights way beyond trademark's traditional reach. For example, dilution, which gives famous marks the right to stop other people using something that sounds similar, even if there's no likelihood of confusion at all, even if it's in a completely different business, even if there's no economic impact, even if there's no actual confusion, and so forth. Second is the franchising revolution. If you think about it, somebody who buys an Indiana University t-shirt might want to say, wow, I hear Indiana University makes great t-shirts. They're just fantastic. Or they might want to signal their affiliation. Now, if they're signaling the affiliation, for the economists among you, you might say, well, who should get the surplus for that? There, it's not like Dove on soap. There, it's just like, I want to say Indiana on my chest. And I want to buy IU on my chest. And I want to buy the t-shirt. And the t-shirt costs $3. And if Indiana University has the right to exclude anyone from putting that on there, remember, nobody thinks that this is, oh, I only buy IU t-shirts. This is just, I support IU, like a placard. Who should get the consumer surplus there? Indiana University? Well, source buyers who think, I want to say it came from Indiana, they'd say yes. Affiliation signalers would say, I don't care, I just want the t-shirt, the $3 t-shirt. Who should have that consumer surplus? So that's one set of changes. The second set of changes has to do with universities, and in particular, the range of things that universities now do or think they do. We know what universities do at their core mission, obviously, research, scholarship, teaching. But universities now increasingly are part of this franchising revolution. If you have a look here, these are the range of things that Duke says that it owns. A wide range of products sold and licensed by Duke University in virtually all areas of endeavor to men, women, and children of all ages. So if you look and see this on your chat, it's literally everything. We only gave you, a tiny subset of all the things here. Basically, Duke is saying, we can put our name on anything, and therefore we have a trademark in Duke for anything. Fridges, sure. Toilet seats, sex toys, sure. Duke does reproductive counseling, why not, right? And so what this means is that the notion of trademark law has gone wrong, right? Because now it would be Dove for soap, and is infringed by Dove for chocolate. So beyond that, the question is, what does this mean for university brands? So a corporation seeks to maximize shareholder value, but think about the roles of a university. A university has many goals, right? Multiple goals. How well are those goals served by by being a mega brand? Next one. So here's the vision of what universities do. As you can see, the core educational services, and then there's outside that, yeah, sure, there are sports programs. That's a legitimate part. That's something that makes people feel good about the school. And then we get franchising, and now we're starting to move outside, and now there's university as mega brand. So one of the things that this study indicates is that universities are becoming mega brands. You might just laugh at Duke, and we encourage that, of course. But we think Duke is actually a bellwether. We think Duke might represent the future. So this is something that really repays attention. So keep going. So what we're talking about goes way beyond what Duke does. People keep using trademark law to manage things that really seem far afield. You may know that Boise State plays football on a rather garish blue field, but they also decided, well, since we have a blue field, we will claim a trademark in all non-green sports fields, right? Why? How? What does this mean? This, by the way, is just made up trademark speak. You say blah, 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 because trademark, and people go, oh, wow, I didn't know that was real. It's not. It's completely made up, but people believe it, and therefore you can bully. It's over assertion that depletes the commons. But it goes further. This was, and I'm sure that Scott will, as a Stanford alum, will appreciate it. This was a movie which was going to be called Stealing Stanford. And Stanford said, we can stop you from having a movie called Stealing Stanford. It was about someone who paid for Stanford education by stealing stuff. Must have stolen a lot of stuff. We can stop you from doing that because trademark law, jazz hands. Trademark law doesn't allow you to stop saying things. It's just like, it's ridiculous. But they folded, as people often do, and changed it to stealing Harvard. And as a Harvard alum, I'm glad to say that Harvard said, we're fine. We don't care. But it goes further. Felicity. In this, there was a young woman who went to university at NYU and she had sexual relations with people. Nothing could be more foreign to the college experience, obviously, than any kind of sexual experimentation. But NYU freaked out and said, we can stop you because trademark law. Again, this is just nonsense. This is just plain old speech suppression. Should universities really be in the business of suppressing other people's speech, where it's just incidental? They changed the name of the college. Same thing with other examples. Conclusions. Should we care? Yes. I've argued here that you might think it is, of course, more consequential if we screw up the balance between public domain and property in the context of, let's say, patents or even copyrights. But it does matter because increasingly trademarks are the way that brands consolidate, that they sometimes engage in monopoly, super competitive pricing, that our culture is dominated by brands, that we come to define ourselves by brands. There are a lot of spillover effects to this behavior. This isn't just a matter for experts. It's not just a matter for the licensing department. This is a matter for citizens to start thinking about going, what does this over assertion do to the public sphere? But beyond that, keep going. There are larger implications for the commons that enable speech and competition. If you can manage to brush me back, as in brush back pitch in baseball, by making unfounded claims, then you can assert rights over something far greater than what you actually have. You could, for example, try and monopolize a term that has become generic. So Kleenex, Murphy bed, shredded wheat, elevator, escalator. These are all terms, aspirin. These are all things once trademarked that have become generic. If you can say, no, 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 we still own it, then you're actually putting your competitors at a significant disadvantage. You shouldn't be able to. What are the solutions? Well, we talked through a bunch of solutions in the paper, and I'd be happy to go into those more in the questions. I think that what I see is a disconnect between franchising and legal departments and the core academic mission of the university. If we want to make a reasoned, thoughtful decision as universities to go down this road, and if we want to engage in the over-assertion of marks in a way which I think is not consonant either with our duties as citizens or with fidelity to the law, fine, let's do it consciously, not just because there's someone in the licensing department who thinks it's a good idea. So that's on the university side. We talk about some solutions on the legal side, which I'd be happy to go into. We think there are some procedural reforms. But the fundamental problem here is what we face is a collective action problem, something that you have all studied. Any individual person who is being unfairly bullied by Duke or anyone else is going to look at it and go, I could fight this and I'd win if I had $30,000, $50,000, whatever, but it's not worth my while. And so each individual person caves, though collectively the social harm inflicted is much greater. It's Manker-Olson all over again, a disaggregated group of people with collective action problems coordinating any kind of response face a single concentrated actor who's a repeat player. It's just classic collective action problems. Finally, I think there's a set of problems, a set of puzzles here. Why do we do this? This, I think, is one of the most interesting things. Economically, this makes no sense Duke is not harmed by the gentleman sitting on the toilet seat saying, do your duty, Major Duke. Duke is not harmed by D-Grill or Blue Ball chillers. There's no conceivable harm. It has no conceivable effect on them, and they get no positive benefit. They do get negative press, at least they will when this paper comes out, which is probably this week, but they pay a lot of money. Obvious explanations for those of you who think about these things. Well, maybe it's, you know, agency costs, maybe the lawyers are making money off this. That's interesting. Why doesn't that happen every other university, right? You might say, oh, no, well, what's happening here is that, you know, there's a Duke is specially situated. Well, our comparative study shows that's not true. I think there's some fascinating issues here. Again, we talk about them in a paper. There's a couple of behavioral economic issues, in particular loss aversion, the asymmetric risk preferences. Why do they affect Dukes so strongly? There, I think that this gives some evidence of what we've seen in other contexts, which is microclimates of legal opinion, which once established have their own groupthink power, and that stuff from the outside doesn't penetrate. I think we've seen that on the national stage in national politics, and I think we've seen it on this stage here. So that's the basics of our analysis, but
we only have one more quick slide. So lest you think we're exaggerating, when we were digging through all of Duke's trademark opposition activity, we found this deliciously ironic one. For real, Duke tried to federally register a trademark exclusively to Duke for scholarly commons. They filed it in June of 2018. 2 years later, after fighting with the PTO, they finally abandoned it in July of last year. So that's our parting.
The irony is fantastic.
It really
so
is.
All your public domain are belong to us for the gamers out there. Anyway, thank you so much, and we'd be delighted to take your questions.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I've got a queue starting. So Gustavo, feel free to either raise your hand or, oops, I see Brian as well. So it's Gustavo, Jess, and Brian. Gustavo.
Okay, thanks, great presentation. In some sense, you already started answering part of my question. I was thinking that essentially you have like two potential explanations here going on. This is the tip of the iceberg. Duke is just showing us what universities will start doing in the future. That's one possible scenario. The second one is that something really particular at the micro level is going on in the legal department at Duke. And essentially, I don't know, I would point you in the direction of doing a little bit more of, you know, micro search of, is there any incentive scheme, a weird incentive scheme going on there? How the lawyers are getting paid? So something a little bit either to kill this alternative or to say, no, this is more likely a Duke issue. And that will not affect other institutions.
Gustavo, you're absolutely right on point. We've thought about it a lot. Some of it is difficult just because of our own position at the university. To be frank, it's a delicate point of view. My own guess, because we have done some research on this, which isn't in the paper, is that it's both. It is both of your explanations. That is to say, there are a set of incentives, but that normally there would be a feedback loop that would catch any kind of problem there, and that feedback loop has failed. That is to say, there's no one who's gone and is like, why are we filing these so many filings? And we've heard from many people that they actually see this as a sign of Duke's ascendance as a university, that this is in some sense a sort of a display of how important we are and how excellent we are. And that, of course, as a status good, you might be willing to pay a lot for. But I think you're right on point, and we have tried to do something and might in the future. Thank you.
And on the question of whether, you know, Duke is a bellwether, we have seen indications of other universities engaging in similar behavior. And so we begin with the Ohio State's effort to trademark the word "the." And the University of Texas, interestingly, has become quite aggressive. So they think they've gone after people for using the words "cancer moonshot" and the hook 'em horns symbol. They have gone after people using it as a heavy metal gesture or as "I love you" in sign language. And so we are seeing, not at Duke's scale, but we are seeing stories about similar kinds of aggressive trademark tactics on the part of other universities.
Thanks for your answer. Thank you very much.
Jess?
Hi, so I found this super fascinating and I also really enjoyed the presentation itself. So thank you for that. Maybe there's something that I'm missing, and to be very honest, I did not have a chance to read the paper in great detail. But over and over throughout the presentation, you mentioned that this is kind of BS in a lot of ways, right? That like these trademark claims are not real in that they are like seriously defensible, which suggests to me like, so at what point does all of this become cheap talk, right? At what point does some one actor have enough chutzpah to stand up and say like, we're calling your bluff? And at that point, once it is exposed that this is largely potentially a bluff, if I'm understanding what you're saying by the claim that like these trademarks don't really have much standing, and maybe that's an incorrect assumption, it seems that eventually, and perhaps rather soon, I would expect, this should become just essentially a cheap talk kind of thing, and at some point people stop believing it, which point, you know, the Duke as bellwether, you know, there's some optimism, right, that like that will fall by the wayside, because at some point people will realize that, you know, Duke has gotten away with this for too long, and that's the end of it because like one actor decided to call them on it. So can you just help us understand what we should expect to see in terms of a behavioral cascade vis-a-vis sort of the revelation that even though it doesn't appear to be cheap talk now, it should be at some point in the near future?
Excellent point. What happens, unfortunately, is again, collective action problems. People do stand up, and when they stand up and fight it, they win in almost every case because these are votes. But there's a problem in information diffusion of the fact that they won. And so somebody needed to write an article which exposed the entire pattern and practice and publicized that quite widely, so that a lot of people had the thing that they could wave and say, no, 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 and that people could cite without having to pay a very expensive lawyer in front of the PTO. We stepped up.
Interesting. So to your mind, right, what's surprising to me about that statement is that like, usually when we think about the problem of collective action, it is not often about some piece of information revelation, right? It's about the fact that like the incentives are such that they are pitted against, like the individual incentive is pitted against the collective incentive. And that's just a very difficult problem to get around. And Ostrom helps us think about those strategies. But here you're saying, here is like this collective action problem that's kind of unique in this way, in that like, if there is sufficient dissemination of information, the collective action problem disappears. Yes.
Not that the collective action problem disappears. I think that it's that Duke is shamed by the revelation of the pattern and practice. So just to be a very concrete example, one of our favorite bars next to Duke was changing its name to become a cider bar. It wanted to change it to the Duke of Devonshire. And so since we drank in there all the time, the guy thought, oh, free legal advice. He said, hey, can we do this legally? And I said, absolutely. Duke has no standing, legally speaking, to challenge you, and they will. And it will cost you about $30,000 to go through the USPTO procedure. And he said, screw it, we'll call it something else. And that happens again and again. And the fact that more well-resourced people stand up against Duke doesn't get around that problem. So it's not that the informational, I was being hasty in my response to you. It's not that the information revelation will solve the collective action problem entirely, though it will, I think, help lower resource people who can just Google Duke trademark bully, and hopefully this will come up. So that will perhaps stiffen their spine, because they can also have free legal advice in terms of the analysis. But it is, I think, that this is going to go up to the president and the provost. And I can tell you that they were mystified when I told them about this. They're like, what? We're doing what? And so that's the solution, I think, not so much the information itself. But great question. Thank you.
Brian?
Good. Thanks for standing up. My question, I'd like to hear more about the remedies, but also make the comment and point to more complex cases, because the one that clearly came to mind for me is the question of definitions of milk. And there you do have some well-resourced actors who are ready to oppose. It gets messy into legislators, but I go to Costco and Costco is caved in. I can speculate why, but so, you know, it can play out in ways that don't seem as easy to remedy.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. That's absolutely different system. They are not so much trademark, because milk, of course, is generic, but rather USDA labeling requirements, where they're effectively saying you're calling this cheese when it's not cheese. And the milk people are going, well, what do you expect us to call it? And so that is, as you said, a straight up political fight. And the question of whether individual companies are going to cave there, I think, is much more driven by their relatively rational perceptions about whether or not there's going to be legislative pushback or administrative pushback in the USDA or in their local state legislature. There's actually an interesting federal preemption problem there, but it is it's the same type of problem. Your point is absolutely right. It's the same type of problem. Although there, for weird reasons having to do with the fact that you have this direct ability of either legislature or regulator to say, we are going to say that only people who get stuff from cows can call it milk or not, right? It's more of a switch that's on or off.
And in terms of remedies, there has been momentum sporadically to deal with aggressive behavior. You probably heard about patent trolls, copyright trolls. In 2011, Senator Leahy was so appalled that Monster Energy went after Vermonster beer that he started a proceeding to take a hard look at trademark bullying. If there were real sanctions for frivolous claims such as these, that would make a difference. Whether that would actually happen, just another remedy in addition to shaming that we were talking with Jess about, it remains an open question. I think they have a lot of other things to deal with right now, the government, the PTO or Congress.
And one line on that, whether it remains an open question, I don't know. After Senator Leahy complained, the PTO held hearings on trademark bullying, and the trademark bullies were so horrified that there should be hearings on trademark bullying. They changed the name in the report to litigation practices.
Yeah.
Do people engage in litigation practices? So if you can't say the word trademark bullying when you're analyzing trademark bullying, that would suggest that there's not going to be a remedy forthcoming anytime soon.
Jamie?
Next person is Jamie, I believe.
Yes, hi. I'm a fan of your work. I actually got to know your work first through your comic book, Theft: The History of Music, and I learned about it. And here's how I learned about it. You'll love it, because you all sent it to Peter Burkholder, and so I took his his last musical borrowing class before he retired from IU, and we used your book in our class for a day on music and the law, and he had never talked about that at all until he got your book.
We're happy because, so if you're a comic book, what do these people do? They they go after their own university and they publish comic books. Yeah, tenure is a great thing. Yes, we do. We did a comic book on the history of music, for any music fans out there, which is about the history of musical borrowing. And it's about the line between the commons and property, or the commons and any kind of restraint in musical borrowing, from the Greeks until rap music. And it's free to download, as all of our material is. Enjoy.
And Burkholder was our muse, and so we are absolutely delighted. We had no idea that he actually used it in class. That's fantastic.
Your colleague, Professor Burkholder, for those of you who don't know, is literally the person who wrote the book on musical borrowing. It's not even close, right? He is the figure, and just a giant in the field. And we didn't know he'd used it in his class, so that's why we're high-fiving. So, Jamie, you just gave us our biggest Christmas present. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. Well, thank you so much. And honestly, that is the challenge, it seems like. Well, trademark, it seems like less of a challenge than with music, because in music, teasing out the distinctions between ownership and right of use sometimes can be really, really challenging. And I don't think well, I would like to say nobody's come up with a good way to talk about that. And I think it's because of the conflation of terms, right? I'm sorry, I'm changing this conversation to music, but this is my thing. So actually I took some of your, I took the ideas in your work and I looked at musical style, and I decided to look at it as this aspect of, look at musical style as a cultural institution. And I was surprised at how much the definition of musical style actually aligned with the definition of institutions. It was basically like rules constraining people in certain practices. I know trademarks behave a little bit differently, but it seems like we're up against a cultural challenge of what ownership is. And that's the common tie between like your talk today and like the talk about like music and copyright is our cultural notions of what ownership is and what right of use is. And so I don't know, how do we change the culture? I guess that's probably the biggest question on all of our minds.
Yeah, I mean, I don't. Well, personally, I don't think. I mean, I'm a dilettante. That's which means I until I got interested in some other stuff. But I think I think your comment is right on point, because I think we're facing a similar issue in all of these cases. We have an intangible resource, whether it's trademark or music, which is important both economically and culturally. And we have to draw the lines about what is ownable and what is usable by the next creator or competitor. And those lines, because it's an intangible resource, are heavily dependent on all kinds of cognitive framings. So that whether I call it, you invaded my land, right? It's like, right? James Brown, when his stuff was sampled, would say, can you steal the hairs off my head, right? So it's a very powerful framing, right? But then you're like, wait, you can own the 1-4-5 chord sequence? You can own the paradiddle on the drums? Like, no, of course not. And so it's that line between commons and property that I think occurs in all of these areas, and really is something which I think we hope that there's some great work being done, partly inspired by Lin, in this area, but honestly, there could be much more. This is a fascinating area. And I think that the tools that the Ostrom Colloquium frequently deploys are exactly the tools needed to deal with it. Thank you.
Thanks for reading our book, Jamie.
Yeah, and thanks for reading the book. And I see that there's a comic book on environmental justice.
Awesome.
Under a CC license.
Yay.
That's good. So now next is Joe, I believe.
So thank you very much. I really liked the paper. I was very surprised at the scholarly comments at the end after, I didn't think they could take it any lower, but of course it's possible. I also want to say that I am enjoying the Barlow Symposium. I'm working on a piece based on that, so I'm enjoying that right now. But my question is very just practical and curious. Who files the oppositions for Duke? Is it in-house or outside counsel? If it's outside, what are the firms?
Yeah, it's outside, as you might expect. And what's interesting, I mean, this is the stuff that we, that gets sensitive. It's an excellent outside firm, very highly regarded, we think very highly of, that actually has been a mainstay in defending notions of fair use in the copyright context, including, Duke University Press was doing a book which featured basically Barbie as the sexualization of Barbie and the way that Barbie embodies female objectification. And of course, Mattel, started rattling their sabers, and the lawyers were great at pushing back and saying, this is nonsense. We get to talk about this. This is speech. This is academia. But it is an outside counsel, and it is certainly possible that there is an economic interest there. It is also the case, though, that the licensing office, which is frequently called on this, people call them up and say, how come you guys are trademark bullies? And the licensing office and the GC up to now have been right behind it. So it's not the disconnect explanation. They are aware that they are asserting a lot of oppositions. Whether they think those oppositions are as bogus as we do, I could not say. We assume good faith on the part of our colleagues. There is, this we talk about a little bit, the microclimate of maximalism, where you start believing the most extreme version of every trademark doctrine, so that you start thinking, well, Duke's a famous mark. It isn't. There's a technical definition of fame, and Duke doesn't meet it because it's a general use term. And since it's a famous mark, and there's sort of, if you turn all of the dials up to 11, as it were, then your rights of assertion can seem reasonable to you, even though an external observer would go, no, this is crazy, it doesn't apply. So I think it's not just the disconnect between outside counsel and the licensing office.
Thank you.
Great question. And we're up to Eric, I believe.
Yeah, thank you. This was a really fascinating presentation. Thank you very much. I have a quick question. Did this position start all at once? Did they just jump in, and were really aggressive, or did it creep up over time? And how far back do you have records?
It's a great question. We have an intuition on this, but we can't pin it down. Yeah. I think it started gradually. If we were going to make this, if we were going to do something like Gustavo was suggesting, you'd probably actually look for the point where different people got hired and see whether or not there was, a spike there. But I think there's also a correlation between Duke's vision of itself as a national player, and I do think that there is a version of this. a colleague, Michael Madison, who I was hoping might actually, who's done work with you, I was hoping might join today, was saying Yale does things very differently. Yale doesn't object when people use the Yale name. Rather, they boast about it. And when you come back for alumni weekend, they have these are how many people referred to Yale in their movies and whatever, right? Which is the flip side. You're still using IP to boast, but in a completely opposite way, right? So I think there's a weird status thing going on. And I think the status correlation and the hiring correlation probably go together. Great question. And so
Brian's making a point about the one-way protection in music.
Yep. Something
that we actually write about. Thanks, Brian. We quite agree.
Yeah, the one of the things that well, I've read a book called Shame and Software and Spleens, which talked about the way in which the European intellectual property tradition focuses on the solitary creator, and that this tends to undervalue the contribution of the commons, for example, the commons of, the Mississippi Delta blues, in ways that particularly ironically may end up that the communities that came up with particular traditions may then be denied them by the first person to freeze them and slap an IP right on them. It is a more complex story than that, I have to say.
As Jamie points out.
In the appropriation. And actually many people so bottom line, there's been massive appropriation, particularly of African-American musicians and music, inadequate credit, inadequate compensation, point. Musical borrowing, crossing the lines, has also brought us all kinds of cultural benefits, including African-American musicians. And in fact, during the Civil Rights Movement, people in the NAACP and in the Legal Defense Fund argued very, very strongly that the musical borrowing that happened across the race line back and forth was actually one of the most potent forces for integration and civil rights. We're academics, right? It turns out that when you look at a thing, it's complicated. The outrage at appropriation is completely justified. Check. And complex when you get into the details, but happy to pursue that offline, Brian. Barb.
Hi, I'm Barb Cherry. Nice to meet you. Also an attorney, so I understand the lingo. I wanted to get back to the fact that the data reveals that Duke, at least for this time period, is rather an outlier.
Yep.
Okay. And I think more work needs to be done to identify potentially why. And I think you need to broaden your scope beyond the traditional behavioral economics perspective and think more in terms of organization behavior. Mm-hmm. When I went back for my PhD, probably my biggest learning, even though it was in communication studies, I took a series of courses in organization behavior at the Kellogg School in Northwestern. And it really opened my eyes. Mm-hmm. When you have a dramatic outlier like this, there is something going on. You need to look at the organization. The fact that they're using outside counsel is really interesting because who's approving these legal bills? Mm. I would think that you need to actually go into the university and find out who's authorizing this, what might have changed then inside that's authorizing this change. And it comes to mind, I know it's a little rough analogy, but you look at Penn State and what happened to that football program under Joe Paterno and the kind of sexual harassment things that occurred there because he had the power, okay, to take that culture a whole nother direction. Okay, something is going on inside Duke and its relationship to this law firm is a place to start, I would think, to figure out what is the dynamic that's going on that's feeding this. And until you can do that, I don't think you can start assuming or start making assertions about whether there's a bellwether or not. Mm-hmm. Because there may be something going on with very specific individuals, in key positions of power, and how an organization is structured and where the power lies. Things can lead to an organization behaving in a very dramatically different way from others before you can start generalizing about it. And so I would be interested in doing more work to really tease out the structure inside Duke, key hiring like you talk about. What are the relations between that person maybe and this outside law firm? Maybe they got some deal going. Somebody's got to be approving all these bills, be paying a lot of an erroneous, as you say, really kind of, if these are clearly very far-fetched claims, there's some dynamic going on that is feeding this. And I think you need to be more specific about Duke and how it's structured and key people, things like that, to tease out what's really going on here before I think you can start talking about how it might generalize. It's just suggestion.
No, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, the portion of the paper where we talk about legal microclimates is actually directly rooted in organizational theory. There are a number of possibilities that we raise. One possibility is the bellwether possibility. The second possibility is the microclimate. Obviously, traditional neoclassical economics would say that you would have a convergence of behavior of well-lawyered people, that is, institutions. The institutions would tend to act the same way. You wouldn't get wild variances such as this, because people would look at this and go, this is irrational. And it's actually making us look bad, and it will cost things. It costs money. So from there, the road goes into different directions. The first is to look simply at what we talked about, namely agency problems, i.e. that the agents are not being faithful to the interests of the principal. The second goes in the direction of organizational behavior and the possibility that you can have little islands of cognitive constructions that arise within institutions, and this is one of the great insights of institutional economics as well as organizational theory, that unlike the sort of simple Coasian model of organizational behavior, that you actually find that these can and that they can be remarkably impermeable. The institution effectively constructs a shell around it and dismisses information that comes from the outside, just as a cult does, for example, to use a current example. So we're right now we're done with this. This is going to be published. What we have encouraged people to do, and we hope this may happen, is look at their own institutions and see what the behavior there is, because we think that that might shed more light on which of these is the case. I think we do have a simple test coming up of whether or not this is of what's going on, which is the reaction when this is published is going to be extremely revealing in a couple of different ways. And I think that it might give us some insight on what's happening.
Within Duke's structure, who has to give approval for this outside counsel to make these filings?
I mean, I don't want to go into specific personnel discussion.
Well, I didn't mean like their names.
Yeah,
just like is it the General Counsel University? Is it the president? I mean, these are very important questions. You need to find out who actually gives the approvals, because that's where the power lies.
Yeah,
that's where the power lies to not only initiate but persist.
Yeah.
And
we certainly know that the people that the licensing office and the GC are aware of the oppositions and are aware of the criticisms that have been made of them. So, and I think I'll leave it at that. I believe that Jamie is next.
I was going to ask a follow-up question. You talked about, how there's much work to be done between this intersection between the commons and intellectual property, and I wanted to ask where you thought what kinds of work did. I wanted to ask, specifically what you thought that was, but I also think Scott's question is really interesting about plans for a follow-up study. So maybe, we can talk offline about my question and you answer Scott's.
Oh, no, I mean, I think we can have a swing at both. Maybe I'll let Jennifer talk a little bit about the subtleties of property and commons, particularly in the context of music, but also in some of the other areas we look at. For example, Jennifer runs the Center for the Study of the Public Domain. And we've got a real sort of live real-time experiment in stuff going into public domain that's going on right now. In terms of Scott's question in the chat, any plans for a follow-up study in the next 3 to 5 years? I don't know if we're going to publish one, Scott, but we're definitely going to go back and look. Basically, this is going to come out now, and I think we'll probably get a fair amount of press because people love making fun of Duke. A lot of Duke haters out there, and we're going to be kind of unpopular. What's going to happen, I think, is that this is going to go back to Barb's question, this is going to go beyond the relatively hermetic circle in which these decisions are being made up to the higher levels, and we'll see what happens, and that will be a kind of natural experiment. So we will certainly be looking to see what happens to the rate of oppositions, and if it plummets, that gives us at least some information. It doesn't explain exactly what was going on, but it gives us some information. Property and commons and et cetera, music or elsewhere?
Jamie, yeah, I mean, there's always one of the reasons that there's always interesting work to be done is because the borderline keeps changing. It's a moving target, the borderline between the property right and the commons. So as you know, from our book and from your own work in the music sphere, it was, taken as an article of faith, as you said, that styles and feels and grooves and the constituent elements of those things were in the commons so that anyone, could write a song in a particular style, whether it was disco or R&B or what have you. And then this watershed blurred lines case from 2015 came along and appeared to confer ownership of stylistic elements to a single party. And so when something like that happens and there's more work to be done on what went wrong, why did the line move? Are we going to be able to reclaim it? And so there's a lot, in patent law and copyright law, there's always a lot of work to be done. And one of the reasons is because that line keeps shifting, generally in the maximalist direction. And JB's written a lot about that. So yes, there's a wealth of scholarship to mine that question going forward.
There's a trend of musicologists getting their JDs now too, to be able to deal with these questions. There's a lot of people doing that.
They take my class because I teach a class on music copyright. And so the students who have musical backgrounds in our law school all sort of migrate to my class. And it's really fun because they get to use both sides or, both areas of their brain, the musicological one and the legal one.
And in fact, a lovely story in terms of, sort of maybe bringing it all back to Lin Ostrom. Yeah. We decided it'd be fascinating to get a group of musicologists and musical composition PhDs and a group of law students together and to have a class half and half, where each side got to say, according to their own culture, what was an unjustifiable appropriation and what was a legitimate use. So basically we were getting exactly sort of Lin's kind of stuff, right? Like, what are the informal norms that govern the commons, right? Like, even if you can get away with this, and then how does that compare to the lines the law draws? Now, of course, the language they used was very different. It was a fascinating process of like a semester-long period of like utter mutual incomprehension that gradually they started to understand each other. And then each music student had to compose a piece that was right on the line of infringing copyright. And then the law students had to actually be the lawyers suing them and defending them, and the other musicologists had to be the expert witnesses. So we would have a trial every week. And so it literally was playing out Lin's stuff in real time. And my favorite moment was when the lawyer for one composer says, everything that he's done is cliched, trite, banal. There is no creativity in what you have done whatsoever, which is why it is not copyright infringement. And the music student who had composed this piece himself turns around and high fives him and goes, that's why they pay you the big bucks.
And thanks for the kind words about the title. Jamie gets credit for that.
Oh yeah, no, well done. And what a great note to end on as well. I wish we had more time though, because this has been just fascinating. And I can't thank you both enough for taking the time. And we'd love to hear, and maybe we could even have you guys back for a little follow-up to debrief after it comes out.
Yeah,
thank you so much.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. As I said, it was actually for me a particularly special as it were, reunion with the spirit of a fascinating person whose work has much informed mine. So for me, it was a little bit of a kind of an intellectual virtual homecoming. So I'm delighted to have been here. Thank you so much. And thank you for the great questions, by the way, very thought-provoking. I'm grateful that all of you want us to think that we've not got ourselves into enough trouble with our university and that we should dig even further into the insides of our university. My suggestion is like, no. I think the people at the Ostrom Colloquium are ideally situated to do that kind of research.
It gets me interested in looking at IU staff just out of curiosity, but,
thank you. I looked at IU. IU
you?
has filed zero. They filed a few extensions of time to file oppositions, but they didn't actually follow up. So IU's looking good.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
We double checked before we came in, and like just in case you might be like secret trademark trolls, we went and looked. Anyway, thank you so much. This was great. We really appreciate it. Thanks again to Allison for doing all of the work, and for Angie and Scott for introducing us, and for all of you for your questions. We really appreciate it.
Indeed. No, thank you, James. Thanks, Jennifer. Virtual round of applause. We all really appreciate it. And
thanks so much
for joining. Fantastic discussion. Look forward to seeing you Wednesday at noon for Jamie's presentation. Until then, thanks again.
All the best.